Well, the doors are closed and we're ready to begin. Welcome everybody to this latest seminar on new approaches to economic challenges. And every one of these seminars pushes the frontier of thinking at the OECD beyond where it normally is. So these are always very exciting occasions. And today we're very, very privileged and pleased to have Mehrdad Vahabi with a new lens on the political economy of the state around the world. We'll learn that it's also not about those predatory states out there, but it's also about our own states in the OECD. And there is we also will begin with a picture, which Mehrdad will explain to us. So Mehrdad is going to set out his analytical framework, and he's going to tell us about how this applied in the conquest of the West in the United States, and he's going to tell us how it all worked out in the Islamic Revolution much more recently, and Mehrdad was very much involved just by being there and I think escaping. But in fact, Mehrdad's framework and his real project is much larger than those two examples. It is really, it's bringing a lens, as he said, a positive lens, as opposed to a normative lens on how states function. And so we are used in the OECD to using the lens of social contracts, the lens of public goods. These are normative lens. Now, what Mehrdad is going to present to us today is what he calls a positive lens, which means an analytical, an objective lens. How do states actually function? And what is a predatory state? How does it function? What kinds of predatory states? And so forth. And as I said, this is a lens that can be used also to look at quite a number of policy problems in our own countries. And I think you say at one point, Mehrdad, that this is a lens that can apply to all states. And why is that? Well, I've just been reading a fantastic history book by a lady called Karen Armstrong called Fields of Blood, about religion and the history of violence. And she goes through every civilization, but she starts with the transition from hunter-gatherers to agricultural societies. And what she says is that once you move to an agricultural society, functionally, you need a hierarchy. And objectively, you get a hierarchy. And that means you get an elite. And the elite is functionally necessary because it produces organization, it produces culture, and it is the engine also of civilization. But an agricultural society is also an expansionary society, so you get competition with other societies, so you get war. So today we are, I don't know how often in the OECD the subject of war has been on the table, but here at Mehrdad, you're bringing the subject of war. Because I always say in describing the OECD, we discuss every policy area except for three: culture, criminology and penology, and I think we should have a committee on that subject, and war. So today, Mehrdad, you're bringing the subject of war to us. And from a developmental perspective, and that's where I spent my career in the OECD, this is a really crucial lens, and we see more and more analytical work on this from people like Mancur Olson, from Douglas North, the Acemoglu and Robinson book on why states fail, because there are extractive institutions and elites. And Robert Bates, who wrote on Africa in the 1990s, why did we get all these predatory states emerging at that time? So this is, I think, Mehrdad, you're bringing an even more comprehensive view of this phenomenon of the predatory state and how it works. So we look forward very much to your presentation. And after the presentation, perhaps, Mehrdad, you could help us to see how this framework can apply to some of the issues that we're dealing with in the OECD in fields like taxation, in fields like investment, in fields like corruption, in fields like the financial sector. Mm-hmm. So over to you, Mehrdad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much, Matthew, for giving me the floor. Here you have the cover image of my book entitled A Ride for Liberty, The Fugitive Slaves, a work by Eastman Johnson on March 2nd, 1862, a year after the outburst of the Civil War in the United States, when the painter was accompanying the Union General McClellan from Washington, D.C. to Manassas, Virginia. The inscription on the back of this image records that the painter was himself an eyewitness of the battleground. Now, it is noteworthy that this picture was never exhibited during Johnson's lifetime, due perhaps to the charged subject matter. By charged subject matter, I mean to put a slave family in the middle of a picture which was so uncommon, unusual, and even politically incorrect at the time. Now, the image casts light upon a controversial historical issue, still highly relevant to the American historiography, namely, who liberated Afro-American slaves, Lincoln or the slaves themselves? Now, if you look carefully into the picture, you will see in the distance, on the left side of the image, a glittering light reflecting the bayonets and the sabers of a battle, epitomizing the Civil War. The painting is about two major historical events which are in the making concomitantly, intervening and interacting with each other. The first one is the Civil War, a classical warfare, similar to a duel of honor between two symmetric contending parties, namely the South Confederacy and the Union North, confronting each other directly. Now, the other is an asymmetric conflict between manhunters and the enslaved Afro-Americans who attempt to escape from slave hunters given the good opportunity of the Civil War. Fight and flight are thus combined together in a way that one enhances the other. My book is about the second type of conflict, manhunting and the economics of flight. My talk today is focused on chapter 5 to 7 of my book, as well as some new materials that I added since the publication of my work. And for those economists who are more comfortable with modeling, I would perhaps suggest a recent co-authored paper of mine forthcoming in Journal of Institutional and Theoretical Economics, entitled The Economics of Empire Building, Predatory and Price Competition. Be sure that empire building also in this paper means state building, and it is a universal framework. And in a sense, it is a formalized version of the chapter to which I alluded. Now, the agenda is as follows. I start by a brief introduction about the meaning of manhunting. What do I mean? Then I will try to show a double interest for a research project based on manhunting in terms of developing a positive theory of predatory state and assuming a positive theory of the predatory state, we will be confronting a second issue about development. If universally saying every state is predatory, why some states enhance development and others are a hindrance to it. To answer this question, I will review shortly the state of art on predation and asset structure. I will introduce a new typology between captive and fugitive assets that I will oppose to another couple, public versus private assets, necessary, indispensable for a normative theory of the state. Then I will give two illustrations. One, a young republic, American republic, in the first century of its existence. I will take the period of US railway state, 1850 to 1900, and I show why this predatory state was a source of development. Contrary to a second example, young republic this time, Islamic Republic of Iran, in the aftermath of the 1979 revolution, clearly a predatory state, and why this type of a state was and is an impediment to development, to economic performance. A very short conclusion will be given while we will be coming back to the same picture that I've shown to you, but there are some points in the picture that I would like to review it in light of my talk. Now, what is manhunting? In my opinion, manhunting is a particular form of predation characterized by ex-ante domination of predator over the prey. The predator tracks the prey, and the latter should escape to survive. Examples abound. Colonialization and the hunt of indigenous people, hunting of Indians, Blackskins, the poor, Jews, illegal immigrants, refugees, as well as the hunting, pack and lynching, and ethnocide. By contrast, conventional war is a battle over ex-post domination, similar to a duel of honor. One example is already given, the Civil War in the United States, but also Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71. At least 4 big major differences can be enumerated between these two types of warfare. The first one is that in manhunting, there is an asymmetrical relationship between predator and prey. Predator usually dehumanizes the prey as uncivilized, unbrutally, brutally speaking. And in the case of conventional war, we have a relation of symmetrical relationship, a code of honor, soldier towards soldiers, officers towards officers. The second difference is that in manhunting, the war is a war of choice for predator, not a war of choice for the prey. And then the predator can exceed unilaterally. Whereas in the case of conventional war, there is a choice by every party of the war and multilateral possibility of exceeding. The third thing is that in manhunting, you have safe killing. The predator can do safe killing with not much risks. The probability that a predator be killed or fed upon is very low compared to a classical war, which is always marked by uncertainty about the victory, about the result. The last thing is that a viable strategy in manhunting for prey, one of the sides, is flight. Whereas in the second type, it is fight, direct confrontation. Now, there is an anthropological background for manhunting. Anthropologists such as Goodall and Rankom did a lot of studies about this story. They have differentiated dyadic, one against one, to polyadic many against one or coalitionary killing among chimpanzees for dominance drive. Dominance drive is not a drive, nutritional drive, or the need for mating. It is just for dominance. Okay. And we have also some other anthropologists, such as Healy, the recent one, many others, that consider man-hunting as a primitive non-state war. And they oppose it to civilized interstate war. What do I think about these distinctions? Of course, I think that man-hunting is a technology of domination. In this sense, I do not deny that there is something of dominance drive in man-hunting. But the important thing is that man-hunting is an invention of humankind. Why it is a human? What is the invention? Usually we say humankind has invented sophisticated weapons, contrary to apes. I don't think human being invented something which is extremely simple and interesting. Predation without killing. Predation without killing is domestication. And domestication is a particular combination of aggression and protection. In this sense, I do not consider man-hunting as something traditional. It existed very far in the history, but it exists today. It exists today. Look, strategic manhunts. It is the defense doctrine of US during Donald Rumsfeld since November 2001, after the disasters of September 11th. That was announced as policy of the United States, man-hunting. It can be by military drones and sophisticated things. But the important thing is that. A last point, two forms of man-hunting should be distinguished. Inclusive one, like tyranny, authoritarianism, or slavery, versus exclusive one, like red skin hunting. Now, there are two major interests for a project in terms of man-hunting. I start by the first one. The idea of man-hunting brings us to think about a positive theory of the predatory state. Economic literature has developed a normative theory of the state intervention based on a distinction between public versus private good. The pioneering paper all economists know is Samuelson, but also Musgrave and Musgrave and Musgrave, and they also tried to identify, to substantiate the two particular properties of public goods. They are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Classical examples are always given: military security, highways, and lighthouses. However, in practice, many public goods are provided privately. The paper, famous paper, of course, 1974, shows that even lighthouses were administered privately, while some non-public services have been nationalized. The classical example is postal service in the United States according to the Fifth Amendment. Why is it so? I think because mainstream economics have a heroic assumption of a benevolent state maximizing collective interest. The idea of a state maximizing rent-seeking is still at the margin. The need to develop a positive theory of the predatory state to explain the frontiers of state space as it is, not as it ought to be, is one of the interests of working on the theory of man-hunting. The assumption of predatory state is not limited to developing countries. It covers the predatory core of any state in the world, and in this sense, its scope is universal. But if all the states are treated as predatory, why do certain predatory states lead to development and others don't? Here we come to the second interest of this project: differentiating predatory states with regard to their impact on development. This is a major question of development and underdevelopment. The contrast between a predatory state as an impediment to development and as a source of creating appropriative regime, by contrast with a predatory state capable of developing a productive regime. Here, the scope of study is about developing countries in a comparative perspective with respect to developed countries. Now, a brief, in fact, critical survey of the state of art on predation and asset structure is welcome in this part. I will show how long we have studied this question in economic literature and why there is still some major shortcomings that should be cleared to advance. I have to say that Montesquieu, but also all the founders of political economy as a discipline, as an independent discipline, such as Quenet, Mirabeau, Adam Smith, Sir John Stuart Mill, emphasized the role of capital flight in restraining tyranny. And capital flight was to underline the importance of mobile assets, to have the possibility to flee and to put a limit to tyranny. Mobility in this literature also includes invisibility, meaning having hidden ability, to which I add having the ability to be hidden. 3 examples: credit, because of its dispersion; potatoes, because it grows underground; and cocaine, because it can be masked, hidden. Now, the exit option of an asset is crucial in determining its value for the state. We need to distinguish 2 types of values for any asset: an economic value of an asset and a booty value of an asset. What is the difference? The economic value of an asset is determined in a voluntary transaction, whereas the booty value of an asset depends on its exit option when it is confronted with a redistribution coercively. How should the exit option be determined? Here comes a major shortcoming of the whole literature. We always, in my opinion, confuse 2 things. Mobility usually is interpreted as not being appropriable. Non-appropriability is considered synonymous of mobility. I think these are 2 different criteria. An asset can be mobile, like alluvial diamond, and it is easily confiscable. You can have another mobile asset, like capital, human capital, which is very hardly appropriable. Now, the exit option, in my idea, hinges upon 2 distinct criteria. One is mobility, which shows the ability of prey to flee, and the other is appropriability, which shows the ability of predator to capture. Now, what is mobile? Some assets are movable, capable of escaping from a given state space, since they can be easily hidden, for example, potatoes, or displaced geographically because of a high ratio of value to wealth, such as alluvial diamonds. Movability also refers to the possibility of altering political or authority allegiance without any physical or geographical displacement. An illustration is the position of vassals' rebellion against princes in Germany during High Middle Ages, between 11th to 14th century, as Volkart has shown in his famous paper. Inappropriable. They are assets, some of them, they are hardly subject to confiscation. In which sense? In the sense that any attempt to transfer property rights through coercion destroys the asset or reduces its value to almost nil. Or the costs of confiscation are higher than the benefits of confiscation. Example is idiosyncratic assets. Human capital or investment in physical capital are the classical examples. They are hardly appropriable, whereas generic assets are easily appropriable. Considering these two criteria, mobility and appropriability, all assets may be regrouped in three major categories. First, pure captive assets, which satisfy both immobility and appropriability criteria. For example, landed property. These assets, pure captive assets, delineate state space. By contrast, pure fugitive assets that satisfy both mobility and non-appropriability criteria, such as human capital, brain drain, and famine goods. By famine goods, I take it from the political scientist and anthropologist James Scott. Roots and tubers having the hidden abilities such as yams, cassava, manioc, and yucca. Finally, mixed assets that satisfy one of the criteria. For example, mixed subjective fugitive assets. Mixed fugitive assets satisfy the mobility criteria but are appropriable, like alluvial diamonds. We have also mixed captive assets that satisfy the immobility criterion and are inappropriable, like foreign direct investment in physical capital. Now, what is the place of these last category? They are in between. They have an ambivalent position between state space and outer state space. All depends to the strategy of predatory states to attract them or to kick them out. Now, here you have a recapitulative table of asset and state spaces taken from the chapter 6 of my book. You have here the last line, pure captive assets, which are non-immobile and appropriable, which delineates state space, landed property, and oil. That is also interesting that with this table, you can also cast light on what we call the curse of natural resources. I think the curse of natural resources, they have some very good ideas, but the ideas are a little bit fissy-fussy because they do not relate it to the question of predatory states. They stay at the level of rebellion, rebellious movements. Now, the first line is fugitive, pure fugitive assets like human-specific assets, sweet potatoes and famine goods, which delineate non-state space, and you have in between mixed fugitive assets and mixed captive assets, which are between the two. Now, what happens? There are two ways to extend an space state. The first way is predatory competition, the use of violence, or the size of your army. There is a second way, price competition, or competitive fiscal policy, as Tybalt was talking about it since 1950s. Okay? Now, the use of predatory competition includes captive assets. If you use predatory competition based on aggression, you have good chance to include captive assets. But the use of violence, aggression, is not efficient to embrace fugitive assets. It is very harmful for fugitive assets. The costs of using violence go a lot higher than usual. You need to use price competition for encompassing fugitive assets. Now, for the intermediary assets, you should combine aggression and protection for encompassing mixed assets. Now, you see now why I am saying human being invented predation without killing, a combination of aggression and protection. This is related to how it works with these categories. There are two different strategies for predatory states. I simplify, really, highly simplify, just to contrast two major strategies for predatory states. One strategy is predatory states that combine effectively predatory and price competitions to include fugitive and mixed assets. That's the case of young American republic by the example which I will talk in the next section on US railway station. That is the way you can develop a productive regime and develop, enhance economic development. There is a second type of strategy, predatory states limited to predatory competition, leading to the loss of fugitive assets and partially mixed assets. That's the case of the young Republic of Islamic of Iran in the aftermath of revolution. Here, you will not develop a productive regime, but an appropriative regime, and here we will confront development deadlock. Now, the first illustration is US railway state. There are two approaches in this respect. One is public goods approach, and the other one, which I will develop here, is an appropriating perspective of the state. Why I choose this example? I know as economists you should know right away why. Because transportation and communication infrastructures and military security are always treated as public goods. In fact, the examples provided by Samuelson in his famous pioneering paper 1954, in my opinion, are directly inspired of the American economic history and this period which I am talking about. This is the classical example. A symbiotic relationship between army, the state, and the railway. And we say, as you find in Adler and Polsky, who are historians about railroading in the United States, they consider it that was a complex provided the public goods, necessary to enhance the national economy. Now, American economy is based on this model. Okay. Now, what is the historical background about this symbiotic relationship between the state, army, and railroad? I would say that even during the Mexican War, the US Army's engineering sector was not so happy with railroading. And when there was a dramatic increase in the Army's transportation costs, more than 1,500% during 6 years, 1844, 1850, some questions were raised about the use of railroading. Railroading again came into the picture during the Civil War, before and after, and three options were tried. The first option was a minimal government intervention. That was the option of Confederacy in the South. The second option was a direct military control of the Southern railroads during the war, this time tried by Union. And the last one was a cooperative approach to guide relations with Northern railroads during the war, and this was the option which was adopted. And the result was cavalry railroad complex. Nowadays we talk about a military-industrial complex, but it was born at this time, the cavalry railroad complex. Now, what was its economic efficiency, this model? I checked with Robert Fogel, because Fogel had many, many cliometric studies checking about the real impact of railroading. And he says this phrase, a statement, which is very important. The railroad did not make an overwhelming contribution to the productive potential of the economy. He even compared the possibility of combining maritime roads and land routes, comparing them with railroading, and found that the difference in the best cases is not more than 5% of reduction in prices. Now, political considerations rather than economic efficiency, in my idea, and some of the historians, are the reason for this rapprochement. What is the aspect of political aspect? Creating an imperial army. I should say that in the United States, even after the War of Independence, the army was tiny, demobilized very easily. The real army, continental army, imperial army, was created due to this symbiotic relationship. Now, you will see how. What happened? First, the lands were confiscated from native Indians by the state and granted as freelance to railway companies according to the Fifth Amendment. Railroad companies used them as securities to mobilize loans and attract settlers. On the other hand, railroad companies granted reduced rates for transporting persons and property for the military, contributing to the creation of a big transcontinental army. And the last point, the role of the army in opening the West for settlement, colonization, and violent appropriation of land from native Indians and Navajos, what I called at the start exclusive manhunting. Land here is exactly a captive asset, immobile, generic asset, easily appropriable. But the question is here, was Samuelson right? Was military protection really a public good in the history of, economic history of United States? It would be odd that we consider domesticating the thwarted Indian tribes as public good. But maybe it was a public good for settlers. My contention is that it is not the case, because military protection does not satisfy the two criteria. Starting by rivalrous good. Was military protection a rivalrous good? Absolutely not. Provision of protection to one settlement could deprive others from it due to the lack of troops. Look, Anjavin, 2004, it would give you a lot of things how it was a real question of deprivation. Second, army's protection was an excludable good and not a non-excludable good, limited to Pacific railroads. Railroads were constructed in a sparsely populated region. I noticed and I read Saturday Review in that case, and it is very interesting at that time, all the newspapers. Railroads were created not in populated areas. They were created in sparsely populated areas. Why? Because I will tell you, the army protection was a private protection for Pacific railroads. Army's benefits were three. First, reduced rates for military transportation and creating a massive army. The second, extinction of buffaloes due to railroading, contributing to the weakening of the livelihood of Native Americans. And the third, personal favors to army officers, corruption. If you want the complete list of corruption, please look at Bain, 1999. One example is, for example, free railroad travel, but you have many of that. The use of railroads was a technology of domination over native Indians in order to create an imperial army. But what was the result, the outcome? The outcome was a productive regime. How? Because exclusive manhunting of this for the sake of developing mobile capital, the creation of a transcontinental army to confiscate land and use it to develop what? To develop railroads, settlement, and extending commerce. Never commerce flourished as much as when the railroads expanded. Now, we come to the second illustration, Islamic Republic of Iran and their several confiscatory regimes in the aftermath of 1979 revolution. I think this material I am talking about, there are not much documents, you have find it, they are very sparse. But I really like to introduce Islamic Republic of Iran as a confiscatory regime. There are three cycles of confiscation. The first started just in the morrow of Revolution 1979. What we confiscated? We confiscated the assets of the late Shah and 53 industrialists exiled in the aftermath of revolution. Khomeini's injunction referred to these assets as spoils of war and specified that, quote, they must be kept and controlled separately from state properties under the guardianship of the jurist, unquote. It is stipulated in the Constitution of Islamic Republic of Iran, Article 49, seizing illicit assets from criminals. Now, what was this sector? This sector, which was created, was a parastatal sector, which is not under the control of a state. It is nor under the control of traditional Shiite clergy, because the custodianship of the supreme leader was needed, a part of the clergy, and they created such a story of Bunyad. Perhaps you have heard about Bunyad. Bunyad, or Foundation of the Oppressed and Self-Sacrificers, is a very big institution. The size and the scope of this institution is similar to that of a government. It is a state in the state. Its holdings worth $30 billion in 1995 and $100 billion in 2013. The second wave is just after the end of 8-year war with Iraq in 1989. An edict, again, signed by Khomeini after the end of the war with Iraq in 1989, regarding the abandoned properties due to war. For what? To manage and sell properties without owners and direct the finance, the results, the fruit to charity. Okay. Now, these were called setat, or headquarters for executing the order of the Imam. If you want a detailed report about the acts of these setat, you can refer to Reuters report 11th, 12th, and 13th of November 2013. Now, at the start, it was for 2 years. Excuse me, I have not said. At the start, it was 2 years, the period which was considered, according to Article 45 of Constitution. It exists now for 24 years. Okay. At the start, it was 2 employees handling all the stuff. Now it's more than 500 people in the Beit Imam, in the supreme leader's house. Okay. There was systematic seizure of thousands of properties belonging to ordinary Iranians, businessmen, Iranian living abroad, members of Baha'i religion, and others. Total amount of assets estimated at $95 billion, 52 of them on real estate, 40 billion on investment fund. From that, 3.4 a stake in telecommunication. Now, here comes the story of privatization in Iran since 2004. You know that the initial constitution in 1980 stipulated that all major industries should be nationalized. Now, in 2006, in 2004, Khamenei, the new supreme leader, who is now the supreme leader after Khomeini, ordered a revision of Article 44. Due to a ballooning budget deficit, Khamenei issued an executive order to privatize 80% of some state-owned enterprises, including banks, insurance companies, and oil and gas firms. Oh. Applauding for this idea of Khamenei by a very prestigious institute, international institute, IMF, International Monetary Fund. That's going in good direction. What happened? What was privatization? Iranians call it khodemani sazi, to change the transfer of property from one hand to the other. In fact, it was a transfer of property from the state sector to parastatal sector. How it was done? Transfer of property from state to parastatal sector is this one. And it is the third wave of the confiscatory regime during Ahmadinejad, particularly during 2005 till 2013. Here you have 3 presidents. Each of them had 2 terms of presidency. One, Rafsanjani, from 89 to 97. The transfer from state to parastatal sector. And I have to say, IMF program for first stabilization was done during Rafsanjani, and under the name of privatization, we passed 6.9% of property from the state to parastatal sector. During Mohammad Khatami, 1997 till 2005, 4.1%. Adding the 2 comes to 11%. during the presidency, the 2 terms of presidency of Mr. Ahmadinejad from 2005 to 2013, 89% of the property of state transferred to parastatal sector. Parastatal sector, ستاد, بنیاد, خاتم. Now, what was the impact? Developing an appropriative regime and loss of mixed and fugitive assets, starting by brain drain. With the immigration of 150,000 to 180,000 educated and skilled individuals, Iran had the highest level of brain drain among 91 developing and developed nations, costing the government an equivalent of $50 billion in foreign exchange currency, according to the report of IMF 2009. 420,000 Iranians with higher education degrees resided in the USA, of which 250,000 were, and now it's a little bit more, physicians and engineers. Second point, transformation of specific assets to generic assets. That means dismantlement of enterprises and trading the components parts of the industry. That is counted around minus 7.8% of the total manufacturing sector. In general, you have this industrialization and the growth of mercantile activity in oil industry, lack of investment in infrastructure, renewing the machinery, refineries, equipment, exploration, and extraction. Here, you have a typical case of predatory state as an impediment to economic development. I arrived to my conclusion. I tried to oppose 2 approaches, 2 perspectives on the state. A normative public good, extremely interesting for handbooks, and a positive appropriating one, related more to the evolution of the frontiers of the state throughout history. The first one is based on a distinction between public versus private goods, with the 2 criteria of non-rivalrous and non-excludable. The second one, a positive theory of state based on captive versus fugitive assets, privileging, favoring mobility and appropriability as criterion. Here, development is considered as a result of a particular strategy by a predatory state combining predatory and price competition to include not only captive but also mixed and fugitive assets. Now, I come once again to my initial cover image. Now, to apply my theory a little bit here, can you see that this horse on the left side, lower limbs, you have 1 socks, white one. You know, the horse has 1 socks on the lower limb. That is very important. That gives you a very good information. In the middle of the 19th century, there was a belief among horse traders that there is a direct relationship between horses' stamina and the number of socks. If the number of white socks were less, the horse was stronger. This horse is a good breed because it has 1 sock, and it belongs to the slave owners. The slaves, they stole this mobile asset to flee to the northern campus. That was the story which happened several times during this period of fugitive slaves. Many horses were stolen by the fugitive slaves because they were mobile assets. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mehrdad. Well, I think that we can appreciate the very large vision that you have brought to this work and the importance of the concepts and tools that you're adding to our capacity to understand not only history, but an evolving world and some of the key issues that we are still dealing with in the world and in this house. So let me first of all ask from the floor for any comments, general comments, appreciation, critiques of this framework, and then we might dig a little bit into some subject areas which are under study in this house. So, who would like to ask Mehrdad some questions or make some comments? Yes, please. Could you tell us who you are?
Yes, my name is Aurélien Toby. I work within the OECD actually for the... You said we don't look at war, but we do actually. I work for the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building. And we do actually sort of work on violence and wars and these sort of things. And I've worked in my career in DR Congo, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is usually described as a predatory state. And then in Mali, which to another extent actually has some aspects of predatory. And I'm interested in that actually because predatory states and failed states are a key feature of our work. But they tend to be described more as a system rather than the way that you describe them, actually. And having an economic perspective on them is really, really interesting. But the two examples you provide are time-bound. And they're time-bound. I mean, they're about events in the history of two different states, basically. And they're not really about the system of the states, which could be described as predatory in some aspects. So I wonder whether your model could actually apply to something that is not about an event or about one particular goal, for instance, such as the building of railway or the privatization of assets in the Republic of Iran. Can it be also applied to something a little bit more systemic, structural, basically?
Hi, my name is Luciana, and my family is from Argentina, so that's why I thought that this would be an interesting talk, because I feel that this idea of predatory states is very prevalent in our country. So I was wondering how we can move past this dichotomized view of predator and prey in the future, especially since, well, obviously no one wants to give up the position of domination, and then those who have fallen, I guess, into the prey category have a lot of, things that they need to hash out as well in terms of forgiveness and moving forward. So that's how I'm wondering, or that's what I'm wondering. Thank you.
I just have a question about your last point, your conclusion. Development as a result of particular strategy by a predatory state combining predatory and price competition. Is that a general comment? I mean, is that you think that in any case, any type of development should could be described like that, or it's in some instances only?
Okay, Mehrdad, would you like to tackle those opening shots?
Sure. Very important. The first question. What I did was systematic analysis of the question of predation, or was it related to somehow a state? I think in both cases, I try to show that is a real systematic question. What do I mean by systematic? In the case of Iranian case, is very clear, crystal clear. In the case of Iranian case, it means that property rights are indeterminate. What I am trying to say is that the state has an impact on the way institutional changes are going through, particularly with regard to definition and enforcement of property rights. Now, in Iranian case, it is clear that you have a predatory regime with an aggressive policy which do not lead to the protection of property rights. It makes property rights in Iran indeterminate. The exact case is the parastatal sector. What is this parastatal sector? Parastatal sector, if you call it as private, because it was born by a policy named privatization. If you say it's private, it is not private. because it benefits from all types of subsidies. If you say it is public, the response is no, it's not public, it's a revolutionary institution. It is not public at all. It is not under the surveillance, the control, no transparencies before Parliament. It is a type of institutionalizing the indeterminacy of property rights, related just to the character, aggressive character of the state. Now, in the American case, what happens? It is the creation of private property. We destroyed the native Indians tribal society, stateless society. We confiscated the landed property, and we developed for the first time a transcontinental army to do what? To expand commerce. We obliged the Indian natives to become new merchants. Is it a change? It is a systematic change. Of course it is a systematic change. No, I don't think that what I did was just a sectoral analysis. It is an analysis of how property rights evolve. If we consider the idea of a public good approach, what is the main idea in a public good approach? The state is the definer and enforcer of the property rights. I would say it's not so obvious. Come and see whether really states enforce and define, or it does it in different ways according to the strategy it chooses. Now, in the case of Argentina, I think that your question about how we can come out of this vicious circle, domination or others, and I think it is related also somehow to the question raised by Mathilde. The last phrase in conclusion, that I say that a predatory state can develop if it follows a strategy of combining mixed and captive assets, is a general, universal thing. My answer is as follows. What is mobility? I mentioned two major ingredients of mobility. The first one was a geographical dislocation. Okay? Some places are more mobile than others. For example, frontiers of the states more mobile. You can also say that there are some parts that the state has no reach. They are invisible. Okay? Mountains compared to valleys. Okay? Now, the second thing is not geographical, geopolitical location. For example, places that are at choke points, like maritime roads, they have more easily mobile. The second aspect which I raised was a question of political allegiance. You can have the same place, but change your political allegiance. In that sense, you gain in mobility. And I give historical evidence. I gave the example of vassals in Germany during their high Middle Ages. Now I substantiate this idea. Mobility is also an indicator of institutional change. I give you an example. This example is also given in my co-authored paper in JITS. You will see this example regarding the creation of Napoleonian army and French army in general after the revolution of 1789. Now, if you have a land reform, peasants, which were before more immobile, becomes free to move. The same is true for workers. Laborers, in fact, wage earners, salary takers, they have a displacement, geographical, more possibility of movability. Now, institutional changes increase the mobility. And I think most of the changes which are known as modernization are nothing but a progressive increase in the degree of mobility. This is not only true about capital, but it is also true about labor. And it is also true about highly qualified skills, which gives a possibility of mobile. Then, what means mobile? and what is a fugitive asset change frontiers with institutional changes. Now, what I am suggesting by this categorization is to give a general indicator to measure the institutional development. Would I say that in every cases and everywhere we have the same policy? No. But the result of the policy should be reflected in the structure of combination of these two. In other words, what we say also about public versus private goods, public versus private goods should apply to everywhere. Argentina, it should apply also to Chile, or it should apply to the United States, to France, to Germany. Now, I use another way to see this in terms of fugitive and captive assets. But the content, precise content, the specific content, is really related to the way institutional change is running.
Okay, thanks. Mathilde, your question, do you think that you're enlightened on that, the difference between predatory and price competition?
I think my question was whether it's always the case that development comes from that. You always have predatory states that use also competition, a combination of predation and competition to develop.
Results all will be the same. I don't say that we do not need specifically to analyze each country and each historical context. But the result of this change always would be that for development. For me, development is essentially this mixture of mobile or fugitive capital that can be handled by the state. The more state capacity, or other terms, the strength of state capacity is reflected in the way it can attract mobile assets.
Well, one question that comes to my mind is this one of, okay, a predatory state, any state has power. What is it that causes a state to become a developmental state rather than a predatory state which is operating in the interests of a group, as it is in Iran, as you explained? What are the dynamics of the incentive structures that would cause such a change?
Are interested to some extent to have wealth creation. Now, the wealth creation depends which strategy you follow. If you follow a strategy of aggressive strategy based on violence, predatory competition, in that case, you will in-chain, you will keep assets, captive assets. That, for example, is Russian Empire. For a long time, they used, that was their strength, was using the size of army and their strategy, diplomatic strategy, to have, in fact, build an empire based on violence. That was the Charles Tilly description of this type of empire building, the Russian case. Now, if you want to encompass not only the captive assets, but fugitive assets, then fugitive assets as well as mixed assets cannot be captured, enchained by pure violence. Protection should be added. Instead of aggression, you should go towards enforcement of property rights. Institutional changes related to define and enforce property rights become necessary. Not because the state has become a public agent, but because the state wants to enrich and augment the amount of its taxes dishes. The size of taxes depends whether we will be able to attract mobile assets. In this case, yes, developmental state is a state capable of protecting, not only aggressing, protecting property rights, defining property rights, in this case, enhancing the capture or the attraction of mobile and mixed assets.
Okay, thank you. Anybody like to take the story further along these lines? Mathilde.
I have a question. I'm not sure it's super relevant, but I was struck by what you said about modernization as a progressive increase in mobility of assets. And here at the OECD, we are currently embarking on a big reflection on the effect of digitalization for economies and societies. So maybe we can say that digitalization is like the ultimate mobility. So what would be the consequences in terms of your analysis of, role of the states and capacity for predatory states, etc.?
I think there should be, in fact, what I said here was really the basic point, the basic project. But if you enter into the book, and now I have to do some advertising for my book, if you read the book, you will see that I distinguish different groups' mobility. For example, poor people. What is their mobility? Are they mobile? I cited the example given by James Scott, famine goods. Famine goods are what? Are people who were against the valley states who take refuge in the, in fact, hills, mountains. Okay, this is the story of Southeastern Asia. Okay, so every stories of Burma and many other countries is this. Now, famine goods was a way to escape from a state enforcing a lot of taxes, but it is not the same as merchants and bankers. They were also mobile, but this one was a powerful group, could directly negotiate with the tyrant about a parliament. Here comes the difference between the strength of each group. One group has the strength of destructive power, screen power. That's the poor people. Whereas those who are rich and mobile because of this richness, capital flight, they have the possibility to negotiate with the states. And I would say that with the development of digitalization, transnational mobile capital, finance, and other things, they start not only to be any more escapee, but a powerful force that makes the state to obey their commands. I mean, escape economy, flight economy starts from a time and changes to another thing. Flight can be a source of relief for the dominees, but it can also become a force for becoming dominant. Now, the process is a very rich thing. If you want to find it more, please read chapter 7.
Thank you. And on the situation in Southeast Asia, I was last year in Yunnan province, and we were looking at a national park where there are ethnic groups who lived at different heights on the mountain because they were indeed escaping, and the poorest people had to go the furthest to escape. They had the poorest crops. Very interesting situation. But listen, we've just come to this point where the increasing mobility of assets is changing the relationship between the state and the other actors, the actors with mobile assets. And indeed, I mean, here we have a large part of the OECD agenda right now, as Mathilde has said. So where is this taking us? For example, in the area of taxation, we have base erosion, profit shifting. We have Amazon, and we have Google and Apple holding their assets in some kind of financial space out there, and not wanting it into the hands of any government. And there are big legal and other tussles going on right now. Where does your analysis helps to illuminate that? What does it do in terms of telling us where is a kind of resolution of this?
Please. Excuse me. We are giving a compliment to the new book of Stringham, Peter Stringham, Private Governance. And he tries to show how the first, stock exchange market, Dutch stock exchange market, as well the London stock exchange market, was created and developed in the 17th century without the help of the state, and how stockbrokers worked, and they developed, in their groups, they developed rules for behaving. And he shows that this story that state was the source of stock market exchange is completely nonsense. And really, he shows us, because when you see the laws enacted in the 17th century, the state was against. For example, future market, immediate transaction. Well, state was against this type of transaction. Now, I think that one of the reasons to think that the perspective, you can call it an anarchist perspective. I am not here today talking about anarchist perspective. I am talking about the other side, predatory state. Is that many things at a transnational level shows that we do not necessarily need a national state to coordinate. Many things are doing, for example, internet is a very good example. There are many, many things that are not, started and invented or yet controlled by the state, but it does not avoid, it does not shun the possibility of their workability. Now, afterward you can say, okay, how is the distribution of the wealth? Why should we regulate all these stuffs that come into the picture? But I just want to take a lesson from that this story of a state being there always to develop market is not a real, historically based story as it is always pretended to be. Now, that's my first remark. The second is that it is true that having transnational mobility makes the possibility to control the state and to act as predator. We have mobile predators. Now, what does it give to us? It brings us to understand, to distinguish different social categories with different type of mobility, and their possibility to be used as a flight or as a way to track other groups. Now, this also brings us really to say that, for example, is it true that the European Union is a technocratic institution? Is the independence of national banks is a necessary thing? All these questions should be also, in my opinion, also looked from the picture, from the landscape, from the lens of predatory state and fugitive assets. Again, I have given some of the thought in this respect in my chapter 7, if you look into it.
Right. Well, here we have the prospect, or even the reality, that there are private groups able to loot the state.
That's for sure. Yes.
But in a more generic sense, as you were explaining, that capital flight, asset flight is a form of control on the state, then if we go to more and more extreme mobility of assets, whether it's human capital or physical capital or whatever, what is the future of the state?
That is a very good question. Personally, my pleasure will be a world without state or a coordination. I really share, in general, universal humankind organic coordination. I am not at all advocate of a state society. I am an advocate, that is my dream. But in reality, what we will have is a very big question about the way at an international level we can coordinate things, which do not limit itself to a state. That means also definition of some rights at an international level in the absence of a universal state, which is, in my opinion, the huge task of humanity at the present time. in the 21st century. Now, but really it is important to distinguish between different type of mobility power. If we do not, of course, we will treat, private looters as if they are good escapists. No, I am not arguing. These private looters today were before, during 17th, 18th century, sure, the victims or coming to a kind of compromise with tyranny. But today, they may be something completely different.
Right. Any further issues, questions that you would like to put to Mehrdad? We've reached quite far. We're in our discussion, Mehrdad. We are at a rather fundamental issue here. Is it time for lunch? It's time for lunch. Well, let me just thank you, Mehrdad, for coming here today and laying out this very penetrating analysis of how states work, and as against the normative lens that we necessarily must have in the OECD, but we do need the, as you say, the positive theory, the analytical tools to look at what really is happening. And it does seem to me that in the OECD, because of this extreme mobility that we're seeing in assets now, we are in the OECD confronting these very issues implicitly and even to a more extent explicitly. Yeah. So thank you very much indeed.
May I say a word? Thank you very much to you, to Mathilde, and to all the participants. I would say that I didn't say one thing, and I want to finish with that. The immigration, massive immigration from Middle East towards the Western countries, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran. This is the real story which I would like to narrate. Escape, that right for liberty is still relevant, but with other groups of people under the situation of manhunting.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for being here and contributing.